Alrighty, so why don't we go ahead and kick it off? Thanks again, everybody, for joining. This is actually the second installment of our user friction webinar series. We actually ran a similar event back in March of this year. So if anyone was present for that one, this will be pretty similar. We have some new examples to share that we've discovered over the past 6 months, and also a couple exciting updates on the LogRocket side related to the user friction topic. So super excited to hop in. And quick announcement here, we are offering free LogRocket swag packages to any attendees of the webinar. All you have to do is either attend a live demo or sign up for a free trial following the event and just record your first session replay, and you'll be eligible for some free swag. So definitely keep that in mind. The custom socks are definitely a fan favorite. And then quick intro from me before we hop in. My name is Will Berner, and I'm one of the growth marketing managers here at LogRocket. Been here for about 4.5 years. And one of the things that we focus on a lot as a company is this idea of helping our customers build more perfect digital experiences. And a big piece of that is identifying and rectifying instances of user friction. So it's something that is kind of always on my mind, even when I'm just like downloading a mobile app on my personal phone or browsing the web, kind of always keeping an eye out for interesting experiences or weird bugs or just things that most people, I guess, probably wouldn't think about most of the time. One of the things my team is also focused on is our in-app onboarding experience. So that also will be the basis for a few of our examples later on in the presentation today. All right, and then last kind of intro piece here before we hop in. The webinar is brought to you by LogRocket. We're an all-in-one digital experience monitoring platform. We combine session replay with issue management and product analytics. So to quickly explain what those are, session replay is basically this idea of recording videos of users on your web or mobile application. So in this little example, you can see someone is navigating the eBay website and running into an issue with this buy it now button, not responding. This idea of issues is basically all about proactively identifying the most impactful issues that your users are experiencing and surfacing them to you. So that can take the form of bugs or JavaScript errors, or things that are more UX focused, like rage clicks, funnel abandonment, dead clicks, and the likes. And then the last piece is this idea of product analytics. So very customizable, but this is one example of a funnel that a user might build out using LogRocket. All right, thank you for sticking with me through that. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start out by just defining this term user friction, explaining what it means, and then looking into a framework for categorizing some of the various flavors of user friction that you might encounter. We're going to talk a little bit about how these different flavors need to be balanced, and it's not always as simple as just eliminating interactions or removing friction entirely from your product experience. We'll talk about this concept of friction as a guardrail, and then we'll talk about how you can identify unnecessary friction points with machine learning, which will be our little plug for LogRocket towards the back half here. All right, so what does this term mean? So the way I like to think of it in the context of UX, friction is anything that slows down or prevents a user from taking a desired action. So I think whoever came up with this term did a really good job. It really is exactly what it sounds like. Just like if you're sliding across the floor in your socks, the friction's eventually going to slow you down and stop you. It really is much the same in the context of software and digital experiences. So it sounds really simple when you put it that way, but as we'll see in just a minute, there is a fair bit of nuance to this, and it's a bit more complicated than it might seem on the surface. So the framework that I want to walk you guys through is this idea of the hierarchy of user friction, and all credit to Sachin Rekhi. He's a pretty well-known product leader in the software as a service space, And he wrote this really well-received blog article back in 2017 that kind of lays out this idea of the hierarchy, which breaks out friction into kind of three distinct buckets, starting with emotional, cognitive, and then interaction friction. So let's look at what each of these mean and go through a couple of examples of them. So emotional friction is probably the most abstract. I think most of us tend to think about just interactions when we think about user friction. So like, is this user interface clear and understandable? Are there too many steps? Is the path or the flow we want our user to take intuitive? And that's important, but it's also important to think about things that come from other places. So like within the hearts and the minds of our users themselves. So the way that Recchi defines this as emotions your users feel that prevent them from accomplishing their goal. And it's kind of tough to come up with examples for this, but I think a good one is something like Indeed or a job hunting website where, someone, probably at least a few people on this call today have been through the process of filling out a job application and then kind of sat there at the final step, a little bit uncertain about whether you're really ready for it, because there's a lot of implications to your personal life, relationships, and just a lot of different things that you have to consider in the moment when you're making that decision. So it's not because you can't find the button that you're not moving on. It's because you don't know if you're ready and you're feeling some emotions that are just a natural response to the actions that you're taking. So the second flavor is this idea of cognitive friction, which I think is a little bit more close to what people tend to think of. But this is when the cognitive load is high when performing a task. That would mean that there's significant cognitive friction. So I think a good example of this would be any kind of investment-related product. So even if you're using like an index fund, like a very hands-off investing strategy, there's still a lot of thought that needs to be put into it. And then if you're a little bit more spicy and you're investing in options on Robinhood, for example, it gets like 100 times more complicated. And these are products that you can't really dumb down. Like if you're investing in an options contract, you're going to be thinking about the Greeks, which is like these really complicated mathematical principles that play into whether you're going to get wrecked or make some money on your position. There's just a lot you need to think about. And as PMs, we can't make these actions any simpler, but what we can do is simplify the way that we present these processes to our users. And we'll go through a live example of that in a moment. And then finally, interaction friction. This is like the most straightforward, the one that people tend to think of the most. Which is basically the friction a user experiences when they're interacting with your interface. So that can be those things that I mentioned before, like, are there too many steps? Is the flow complicated or is it easy to follow? One example of this would be some kind of a confirmation message where if you're looking to, for example, delete a file from a storage, there might be an additional interaction that's thrown in the way that says, are you sure you want to do this? And obviously that's serving a purpose, but it is interaction friction in one way or another. So I think that the way that Sachin laid out these categories makes a lot of sense. And I don't know that there's much to add to it from that perspective, but I do think the way that it's presented and visualized could be done better, because I'm not personally convinced that the pyramid graphic is the best way to represent this. I think it's important to consider that each of these forms of friction interrelate with one another and actually balance each other. So rather than kind of siloing them in a pyramid, I think a better way of thinking about it is kind of like a bi-directional flywheel, where at the end of the day, you're actually using these friction points to balance one another. And it won't always be as simple as just removing interactions or just completely deleting parts of your application that cause the user to have an emotional response or strain their brain with a high cognitive load. So let's look at a couple of examples of how these various flavors can actually be balanced. So some practical examples. So here at LogRocket, one of the software products we use, it's called Paylocity, and it's basically an all-in-one HR platform. It does a few different things for us. It's the software we use for like expense reimbursement. It manages our payroll. And then what I wanted to talk about here is benefits administration. So we actually recently went through the open enrollment period, and there's a couple of different health plans that are offered that we can choose from. And the goal of the PM who's responsible for this product, or one of the goals, would be to enable their users to pick the health plan that best fits their personal needs. Because obviously we're providing benefits, we want to make sure that the user is getting the best benefits that are best for them personally. So what can we do here? If you think of it, this is like a really complicated decision to make. There's a ton of different factors you have to consider, like how many family members are going to be on your plan? Do you actually use a lot of healthcare? Like, do you have any unique or special healthcare needs that might need to be taken into account to decide which plan is right for you? And so the PM who's dealing with this flow, they have a few different options. One would be to basically ignore the complexity of this decision in favor of minimizing interactions. So what that would probably look like is just saying, here's the two plans, click the button and pick which one you want. And it does minimize the interaction friction by using kind of a simple single step flow to get the user through that process. But I think like it's pretty clear that at the end of the day, that's not doing much to set that user up for success. So I think a better option would be to actually introduce additional interactions in order to reduce the cognitive load that this user is experiencing. So what this might look like is implementing something like a survey that asks you a series of questions about your healthcare needs and what you're looking to get out of the plan that you ultimately select. And from there, the software can basically lay out some of the pros and cons of each plan and help guide the user to a more well-informed decision. And I think it's important to like think too about being careful to not go too far in the opposite direction. This is such a complicated decision that you could probably build, a 50 to 100 question survey and really just keep going. And at some point, that's not going to make for a very positive user experience either. So the key is to find the sweet spot where you're implementing just the right amount of guidance and interaction to achieve the optimal outcome without slowing down the user more than you need to. All right. And like I said before, I think emotional friction is probably the most abstract and difficult to come up with examples for. But I think a good one would be this new product that Zillow offers, which is basically homeowners can go and submit their property to be listed directly on the Zillow website. There's a couple different ways that this works. It'll either connect you to a licensed selling agent, or in some cases, in specific markets, they'll actually make cash offers directly to you on your property, and Zillow will purchase your property from you directly. So it's pretty obvious this is like a very lucrative business for Zillow if you think about the nature and the kind of magnitude of the transactions that they're enabling here. But something that you need to keep in mind is that this is a very big decision for the users who are deciding whether or not to list their property with Zillow. They're probably thinking a lot about, the memories in their property, people they'd be leaving behind if they were to list their property and move elsewhere. So this is a pretty tricky problem to solve. And you might be thinking, like, this is kind of a silly example. Like, how are we as software PMs supposed to convince someone to do something like this that they're not ready for? And that would be a valid point. But I think the goal here is definitely not to convince someone to make a decision they're uncomfortable with. It's actually to take the people who are going to get there eventually and get them there faster. And we'll talk about this a bit more later, but one of the best ways of detecting instances of this emotional friction, and I think cognitive friction for that matter as well, is for looking for flows that take users longer than expected to complete. So in this example, the person might be sitting there and staring at their screen, and they're like feeling this kind of roller coaster of emotions, and they're trying to decide if they're going to move forward. So our goal in this case is to prompt them back into action and get them to take that next step now rather than tomorrow or the next day. Because if they do it right now, we're in the running. And if they come back tomorrow or the next day and revisit this, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to be coming back to Zillow. They might go elsewhere. So really what we're looking to do is optimize velocity here. And I think there's a few different ways that this could be approached. I think in any case, it's going to involve introducing additional interaction friction. So one thing that they consider is doing like a time-delayed pop-up with some form of social proof that kind of pushes that user towards making the leap. You could tell them something like in this example that a home in their area recently sold for X% above asking, don't miss out. Maybe an even better option would be prompting them with some kind of pop-up that says, this is no obligations. You can see what your options are, but you're by no means obligated to any kind of transaction just by completing this form. So giving people the opportunity to see what their options are with the potential to back out later. And I think in either case, we'd be implementing additional interactions into the flow with an end goal of helping the user overcome that emotional response that they're feeling. All right, so we made this just a lot more complicated than just saying remove steps or simplify workflows. So how can we actually practically balance this? I think the most important thing and the starting point is definitely to make sure you have a clear North Star metric that you're optimizing towards. Because at the end of the day, if you don't know where you're looking to move the needle, you might as well not do anything at all. So I think also just one quick thing to point out, like typically we're responsible for metrics like retention or monetization as software PMs. But we should always be keeping in mind as well if our goal aligns with the user's goal. So once you've established that kind of mutually beneficial North Star metric, go ahead and conduct some testing. And then from there, it's pretty straightforward. Do some cohort analysis and reach a conclusion on whether your solution was net positive. So we can go through a quick example of a product experiment that my team actually ran either late last year, early this year. But essentially here at LogRocket, we have a self-service kind of product-led growth route that our users can take, where they have the option to sign up for the product. They can experiment with a trial period, and they can even purchase transactionally within the UI, all without ever talking to someone. And so there's a lot that goes into that, but at the end of the day, there's a few critical aha moments where users really start to realize the value of the product within that process. And one of those is when the user actually installs the LogRocket SDK and successfully records and views their first session replay. And so it sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but it's actually a pretty challenging problem for us because the nature of the product is fairly technical, and the implementation requires installing a JavaScript SDK into your production application. And we sell to a lot of engineering teams who are able to do that no problem, but we also work with a variety of other job personas, product managers, growth marketers like myself. And in a lot of cases, those folks either don't have the access or the technical ability to install a JavaScript SDK into their production application. So what can we do here? And our hypothesis was that we need to offer a more personalized onboarding experience to our non-developer users. But the first step to accomplishing that would be to basically know who each person is, which means collecting information on their job role as they sign up in the product. So the first step to this was basically see what would be the impact on that North Star metric if we were to implement this extra step of data collection. So introducing a little bit more interaction friction in order to help reduce that cognitive load later down the line when it comes to actually installing the product. So we wanted to see if we do install this, is it going to completely tank our adoption rate? Because at the end of the day, that's the North Star we're optimizing towards. It's not going to be worthwhile if it totally ruins this metric. And what we saw in our initial test actually was that there was a very small but non-statistically significant decline on adoption purely by implementing this job collection step. That was without taking the next step, which would be to personalize the onboarding experience based on that input. So this was a positive result for us. We were pretty confident that we could make up this 2.18% and then some. And then one quick little plug here for LogRocket. It actually is a great tool for performing this kind of cohort analysis when you're running these A/B tests. So you can actually do something super simple like grouping a conversion funnel based on a variety of different traits. So in this example, it's grouped by geography, but something you could do is pass a custom event or a custom user trait to indicate this user saw the variation versus the control, and then see how did this North Star metric shift for those who saw the variation in that experiment. And then to take it just one small step further, we do link failed conversions or failed funnel steps into the corresponding session replay examples. So for example, if you wanted to study users who saw the variation and then did or did not take that desired action, it's very simple to do so. And studying those kind of qualitative sessions can give you a lot of good context into what is actually working within that variation or what might need a little bit more refinement. All right, so moving on to this idea of interaction friction as a guardrail. We talked quite a bit about balancing the different forms of friction, and that typically means introducing interactions to counter one of the other forms. But it's worth pointing out that there are also utilities for interaction friction just on its own. And I think the most common example of that is using it as a guardrail to prevent our users from making very painful mistakes. And one example of this, here at LogRocket, we use a sales engagement software called Outreach.io. And I actually used to be the manager of our sales development team for a period of time. So something that I would do regularly was go and basically queue big bulk email programs for our sales team. And this is a little bit scary because nobody wants to ever send the wrong email to hundreds or thousands of people. So in this example, what the software is doing is actually asking me to confirm my intention. And they're saying, would you like to actually take this action that will impact over 3,500 people? And I like this for a couple different reasons. Normally at this point in a project, I've already spent hours drafting messaging, isolating targets, distributing leads to the sales team. And so I'm really not going to mind taking an additional 5 seconds to make sure that I'm not fumbling it at the one yard line right at the end. And I think it's also interesting that they make you actually type the number rather than just saying, are you sure you want to do this? Because it makes it a lot more difficult to kind of just spam click through the prompts without actually reading them. So this is a pretty good example, in my opinion, of friction as a guardrail. All right, so we talked about balance, we talked about guardrails. Now let's talk about just friction that sucks, because there is unnecessary friction. And I think that's probably what people here are most interested in learning to identify. So I think just putting a quick definition on this can be helpful. There's a couple different ways that friction could be classified as unnecessary. It could be that you're trying to balance one of the other forms, but ultimately your test leads to a net decline in your North Star metric. That would be sad, but it would be unnecessary. Or the friction itself doesn't even attempt to serve a helpful purpose. So things like bugs or poor performance on a page could be examples of this, where it's getting in the user's way. it's slowing them down or stopping them, and it's not even attempting to do anything helpful. So how can we actually identify these instances of user friction? I'd definitely recommend using LogRocket or something similar to it. And one of the approaches that we take here is basically looking for a variety of these different friction indicators. So these are things that a user either does or experiences while they're using your product that is commonly indicative of a frustrating experience. So one example of something that we look out for is this idea of rage or dead clicking. So like when someone is getting really frustrated and they're spam clicking the mouse a bunch of times, or maybe they're trying to click on something that appears to be a clickable element, but actually isn't, that would be a dead click. This idea of frustrating requests is basically an indicator of poor performance or the page taking a really long time to load. But it's something that a lot of teams miss because ultimately the network request succeeds. It just takes a long time and the user reacts negatively to it. There's also this idea of funnel abandonment or interruption of flow. Error states refer to basically defined business rules for things that appear on your pages that are representative of poor experiences. So if you have something like an oops or some kind of an error page that might come up, this is something that can be easily tracked. And then finally, poor performance would really just be anything that leads to lag or slowness or delay in the performance of the app or the page itself. All right, so that's kind of like the first iteration of how LogRocket helped our customers identify these friction points. We've recently released a new product called Galileo AI that actually uses a machine learning program to identify the most impactful issues and friction points that your users are experiencing. And I think this is pretty important because at the end of the day, not all of these indicators are going to be accurate 100% of the time. If you think about it, someone might rage click because they simply closed out of a form before they were finished completing it and it was a mistake. Or maybe your local Chipotle ran out of guacamole, so you're rage clicking in frustration. These things, it's really a hard problem to solve, differentiating between that and something that's actually done in reaction to a poor experience. So the LogRocket Galileo model looks for a couple of different things around these frustration signals to determine, is this a real severe issue? And one of those is this idea of repeated actions. So you can think, for example, of a rage click itself is a repeated action just within a really quick time frame. But we'll also look for things that are a bit more broad in scope. So for example, if a user is filling out part of a form and then reaching a certain point and reloading the page and taking that same step again, that would be a repeated action. And that's something that we look for when we try to identify the probability that an issue is actually severe or impacting the user's experience in a negative way. And then the other main thing that we're looking for with this machine learning model is this idea of interruption of flow. So for example, if we see very dense periods of user activity, and then there's some kind of a frustration indicator, and then there's a period of inactivity following that, that would be an interruption of flow, which is often a good indicator that something actually happened that was either slowing down or preventing the user. So some kind of interaction, cognitive or emotional friction. All right, so let's look at a couple of super quick examples and then I'll open it up to Q&A in just a moment. But one issue that we recently identified with this machine learning model was for one of our customers in the e-commerce space. And I can show you, this is a recreation, so we can't be, showing any live user sessions, but it essentially looked something like this, where the user is navigating this checkout flow. And then they're reaching a point where they're clicking the continue button, but they're unable to move on. And so the model noticed that users were taking repeated actions. They were reloading this page. They were hitting the back button and trying to continue through this flow. And they were unsuccessful in doing so. And then finally, this last example, the customer in this case is a digital travel agency. So kind of like Travelocity, you can use it to book a flight or a hotel room, a rental car. And what you can see was happening here was this idea of a frustrating request, where essentially the application is trying to retrieve some data from the database and it's unable to do so in a timely manner. So the user is given this screen where nothing can happen. And this is a good example of interruption of flow, where there was a frustration indicator in the form of the frustrating request, and then a clear signal of user frustration through this interruption of flow, where there was dense activity followed by a period of inactivity, and then the user kind of resumed their actions from there. All right, and one last thing before we move on to questions. I think a lot of you are probably wondering, okay, this stuff sounds really good for identifying like poor interactions, but how can we actually identify these more ambiguous instances of emotional and cognitive friction? And that's a really good question. I think one of the best ways to do it is by comparing users who complete an action very quickly to those who take a much longer time to complete that same action. Because if you think of it, one of the main indicators of emotional or cognitive friction is people just taking longer than they should to complete a flow. So LogRocket has this very easily customizable metric type called time between events, where you can basically give it a starting point, give it an end point, and then see different percentiles for how long it takes users to complete that flow. And then you can actually view associated replays of the users who did it the most quickly, so those who overcame friction at the highest rate, versus those who took the longest and struggled the most with those instances of friction. So to quickly recap, what I would suggest here is you need some kind of a monitoring solution to identify these kind of key frustration signals. When you identify them, you should consider, is there any utility here? Is this friction point acting as a guardrail? Is it balancing something else? Or is it just purely unnecessary? You can then watch some sessions to get more context around those frustration signals, or rely on the machine learning model to tell you which issues are severe, and then remove or simplify steps or balance the different forms of friction as necessary. All right, so I think we're right on time. Wanted to make sure to leave a few minutes for questions here, but yeah, shoot, like anything you guys have, could be product related, just more broadly about the hierarchy of friction. Would love to hear what you guys have to say, or any questions you might have. All right, I'll give just another minute in case any pop in, but it seems like we might have covered them all. Okay, a question from Ravi. Should destructive actions like deleting data always have some intentional friction? That's a really good question. I think there's no clear-cut right or wrong answer for this. I think one thing to consider is, if the user was to take an unintentional action, is it restorable? Is there a way to revert that action? If the answer is no, then it would probably be wise to implement some kind of a guardrail. If the action is more easily undone or reverted, then it's a bit more of an open question. And I think you'd also have to consider, what would the lift be associated with undoing that mistake? So yeah, it's definitely something that you just kind of have to take on case by case, but I think those would be a couple things to always consider. Yeah, of course. Any other questions from the crowd? Cool. Well, it looks like that might be it. If anyone else thinks of other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm on LinkedIn. My email is also just will@logrocket.com. And I will be sending out an email to each of you with a link to the recording and then those links for the free trial or demo sign up in case anyone's interested in checking out LogRocket or just getting the free swag box as well. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining, and hope you all have a great Tuesday here.